Thank you all for attending and participating. I know it's the 2:30 hour, so kind of the coffee, caffeine kind of kick in the afternoon is probably hitting us a little bit one way or another. So we'll try to make this pretty interactive. Again, my name is Peter McDonald. I live and breathe in the digital identity world. We're both with Symantec, and Ken is on the continuous monitoring side. Originally, this was going to be, if you looked at the kind of whole content, originally Captain Robert Phelps from Michigan was going to be here as well. He had an operational constraint that came up at the last minute and couldn't be here, so we were all three going to be part of this panel, and so we've kind of shrunk it down to two. But his conversation started all this, which was about data sharing and how do I work in a state, in a municipality, and across jurisdictions on data sharing. And once you start having that conversation, in his case, it's more with the prison system, and if I'm pulling somebody over for a traffic ticket and I realize that there's another ticket issued to them or another criminal justice particular situation with that particular person from another state, how do you deal with the information sharing and how do you deal with the authentication and the identity management across those different parameters and across that conversation? And so that's the first part of what we're going to be talking about. As a lot of the conversation earlier today and yesterday dealt with kind of one of two things, whether it's information sharing or whether it's actually identity management or trusted identities in cyberspace. And they're different parts of different problems. If you were here for the previous session, there was a discussion of the goals of one are very different from the other, right? On the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, there's a lot of privacy and anonymity involved in that particular strategy. I want to authenticate somebody that's going to a particular website, but I don't necessarily want to know, I don't want all the people down that daisy chain to be able to know that they're going to the IRS site or the Social Security site. While when we're dealing with information sharing, it's absolutely critical from an identity standpoint that information is provided throughout the whole stream, so there's really direct accountability. So that's where we're going to jump into in this particular conversation. As I mentioned, we're from Symantec. If you have questions, don't be bashful. I would normally stand up and walk around, but we're being videotaped and they've asked me they've asked us to carry the mic if we walk, which is problematic. It would be like the old football days where, the coach had the cable guy that was running behind him, right? Anyway, so let's go on. In just simple conversation, right, when people talk about identities, it becomes a pretty boring conversation. But if you look at kind of everything that's built on top of it, it becomes an absolute critical point of the conversation, right? Whether you're talking about identities from a username and password, and we can, count how many times a second, and actually the number is 7, in which a social media password on Facebook is hacked, or whether or not one believes that passwords themselves are safe. I am of the premise that a password themselves as an authentication tool with a username and password is not safe. Any phishing attack or social engineering, or if you even look at probabilities of how many passwords somebody can really remember and use. So I may have been ID proofed, I may have been vetted, but someone can easily still steal that particular password. And so the question becomes is how do I, in the identity world, really build everything on top of the password and the identity access control into a layered security approach so I can give them appropriate access to information in a very reasonable time to make that decision for the person, the officer in the field. And that's the real challenge and that's the real mantra for us all. And when most people think of Symantec, what you probably think of is antivirus or the Norton line. And so what I wanted to mention is that we have been actually in the authentication business for about 12 to 15 years. Depends on if you're talking about user authentication or device authentication. We are actually the largest cloud provider of authentication services. We do 4 to 4.5 billion with a B authentications a day. If you're dealing with any financial transaction, if you go online, whether it's any of the major banks, whether it's a lot of the ISP providers, all that authentication or 90% of that authentication is actually through a Symantec particular service. So when we speak of authentication and identity and what's going on in the world and where we're investing and where where customers are asking us for advice and information, it comes from that basis of a very strong authentication world that's been around for a long time. And so when you think of the authentication world, let's use just a couple examples here, right? Cloud-based authentication on the upper right, I think there's a pointer in here, right? SSL certificates, right? 93% of the top banks, 4 to 4.5 billion transactions a day, all as a cloud-based service, right? When you see that lock key in the top of your browser, you can click on it, and it often says VeriSign Class 3 certificate, especially if it's a financial institution. That's us. On the identity solutions that you and I are used to, right? We've got the PKI, which is the traditional HSPD 12. I'm a contractor or person within an agency. I do that. That's great. We also have a two-factor authentication, a complete cloud-based service. It's called VIP. And we released actually about a year ago, and it's in production today. If you were at the last session, you may have heard about it, is a FICAM approved solution for level 2, level 3 non-PKI. What that means is it's an interoperable credential that can be used on multiple, what's technically called relying parties, but websites, so that username and passwords don't need to be managed by that particular entity. And so the interesting question is, where does all this go, and why is that of interest in this particular audience when we're dealing with public safety and crime and management of that? And the quick answer to that is there are probably 3 different authentication type large big picture questions to think about, or that you've got. Is number 1 is on a very initial level is, are some of my applications needing two-factor authentication, right? That's great. A lot of vendors are out there. We're a vendor that has a great two-factor authentication solution, and we can talk to you about that. Number 2 is I may have a device itself, whether it's a sensor, whether it's on a car, whether it is a car itself, that I want to validate that particular device itself. And I need a certificate on that device, and I need a certificate between the server. FAA is one of our customers. The old or the historical aerospace system, there was something called the NAS, which is the National Aerospace System. It manages all communication from radar stations to airplanes. That used to be its own private internet. That's coming onto the public internet, and they're using certificates to manage that. So as you start talking from a public safety standpoint of Internet of Things and devices that are out there, one of the things to think about is, how is that device secured that I know exactly it is who he says it is, right? I think we saw an incident a couple weeks ago where there was a Coast Guard reacted to, if I get my information correct, what appeared to be a vessel in the Gulf of Mexico. It was actually not a vessel, it was actually a spoofed IP address that presented itself as a vessel, right? So we're able to protect against those kind of things. But then the most important thing, and let's go back to the conversation of information sharing, is say I'm a fusion center that has a natural disaster or an emergency in a particular area. And I need to be able to incorporate not only other particular folks from other fusion centers, which would probably be under the terminology, and I'm going to use a whole bunch of the GFIPM credential or the GFIPM mapping within the GFIPM trust model within the FICAM credential management system, if you want to think of it that way. Or I may need to bring in medical providers. We have examples of friends of ours that are doctors and such that went to Katrina to help but couldn't be validated as an actual doctor, and so they ended up filling sandbags. Now, is filling sandbags an important thing to do? Yes, but could they have been a doctor if they had been able to be validated by a credential? And so the same thing happens on the online world. And in that online world, then, if I've got a particular disaster in a particular emergency, how can I then support a larger population in a timed response situational type of environment that really supports multiple credentials, access to the information that you need just when you need it for that particular application without having to incorporate changes within Active Directory and all those different components. So I've said a lot of things so far. Questions so far? Okay, no questions so far, so we'll go on just a little bit. So when you think of Symantec, you think of probably what we refer to sometimes as our view of malware in the world. Well, what we've done is we've taken our traditional VeriSign authentication business, and we've taken our traditional security business and mapped them onto each other. And so we now actually look at behavior patterns in authentication that are tied to malware patterns in the world on a real-time basis, right? We have 250,000 sensors around the world. We are processing on the order of 1 billion web requests a day, looking at 5 million emails a day, and looking at about a third of the world's network traffic to manage, from a processing standpoint, where malware is happening. And what we're doing is we're mapping that onto an authentication platform that is able to tell us, hey, is this identity valid or not? And so as you're thinking about, well, I've got a fusion center and maybe I'm in one particular state, how do I incorporate somebody from a neighboring state? And then on top of that say, you know what, I've got a cloud-based application that needs to touch that. Could I then use a single sign-on portal that takes a GFIPM or a FICAM-based credential to allow information sharing for that situational awareness to not only first responders, federal, state, and local, but also volunteers, nurses, doctors, medical practitioners, et cetera. And that's the world of where the authentication is, that's where authentication is going. And wanted to say that it's not a function of fiction, it's a function of reality of what the technology exists today. The great news about all that is it doesn't have to be incorporated, or it doesn't have to be incorporated within you managing all the identities. That actually becomes managed by an external party, and then the attributes associated with that identity are then what you use for authentication. Okay. Again, I live and breathe this, so I can get kind of into the details pretty darn quickly. So just a couple of things. Identity historically has been all around access control, PKI, two-factor authentication, or SSL. The question now becomes is, what if I never see that person, and that the person I need to identify in person, I can't see a badge, I need to give them access to a situational environment, and how do I manage that? And so identity and frameworks, right? It's not validated in person. He's out, or he or she is outside my existing federation or enterprise, and maybe I'm using a GFIPM, or per some of the conversations, the SAML 2.0, which is the security access markup language, or authentication markup language, right? And again, is it an in-person application or is it a cloud-based application? All those are supported. And then timing and security, how do I overlay a security model on top of an authentication model, on top of what I want to then say is a particular incident. It's not that I'm giving somebody access to an application or giving access to information in just a small frame of time. I'm giving them, a large frame of time. I'm just giving them access to that information for a short frame of time. And that's what some, in partnership with some public safety enterprises, they're just beginning this. As you may have heard, GFIPM from an implementation standpoint is still relatively new, but we've been at this and we've got some federal customers using this today. That's that. So what I wanted to mention is the actual credential itself is called Norton Secure Login. It's usable right now. If you're a veteran, the VA uses it right now. As it was kind of mentioned earlier, it answers the question of managing passwords from the standpoint of I, as an individual, just need to hold that one password. Just have to have that one password, and associated with that one password, they can log into multiple applications. If it's a password that needs higher levels of assurance, it's supported in level 2 and level 3, which means two-factor authentication is tied into that. And then we on the back end look at signature-based modeling and signature-based security to ensure that it's not associated with rogue IP addresses or malware that we know and manage and track around the world. Like I said, it uses two-factor authentication. And some of the use cases to think about, and once you start thinking about information sharing, as long as you get the identity right, then the opportunity for information sharing becomes a very real possibility, and something that can be managed across, whether it's a fusion center, whether it's an application on the criminal justice, or whether it's a DHS type application. So that's what I wanted to mention. I didn't want to get too depth into all the nitty-gritty specifics of what the attributes look like on the SAML 2.0 framework, or where trust models are with Cantera or anything like that, but some of those questions do come up. So I just wanted to just kind of leave the conversation there and have any questions somebody might have, welcome to take any questions on the identity side of things. Sure.
So technical solution-wise, have you run into any legal, jurisdictional boundaries, policy, privacy record, any of that kind of stuff impede people adopting this, or they're not showstoppers?
So on the, generally no, okay. The model, it's the Federal Identity Credential Access Management, FICAM, is the model that it actually fits under from a legal jurisdictional. That's out of GSA, it's a federal model. Within that, you have trust frameworks, and you have 4 different trust frameworks. You have In Common, which is primarily for the educational markets, right? You have Safe Biopharma, which is primarily for the pharmaceutical world. We have us, Cantera, and then GFIPM coming out as a 4th model for that. So those are how the models fit. And so what's interesting is it's more of a cultural shift of historically I've had to manage all my username and passwords, right? That's more the issue. And validation of the user and incorporating that from a security standpoint is as much the issue. But then the savings is it's a lot cheaper to have a third-party enterprise manage passwords and authentication than it is doing it inside, right? Password resets tend to be the #1 help desk support call, and depending on the enterprise, right, sometimes it's just a click or sometimes it's actually a call, and those calls can be very expensive. Right? If you look at, and just as a frame of reference, if you look at digital signing applications and I want to stay away from the Facebook, and I can connect with Facebook, and I can connect with LinkedIn, that kind of thing. But if you look at some of the more enterprise applications, which are digital signatures and those that have, not quite chain of custody, but legal ramifications, they are accepting other credentials, and that's where we're starting to see adoption of this, both in that area as well as in the area of healthcare, especially on the medical side for government agencies. And then starting to see some adoptions on the first responders, et cetera, those different applications. Yeah.
Do you get involved in back-end attribute exchange?
So, yes, is the quick answer to the question. Under the original FICAM model, there was a distinction of an identity provider was not an attribute provider. An identity provider did essentially 3 things. They validated the identity of the individual. If it was a level 3, they provided 2-factor authentication, and then independent if it's level 2 or 3, it was a valid authentication, right? It was the SAML assertion back and forth. Under the new model that came out in November-December timeframe 2.0, they've redefined that. Oh, and so back in the first model, there was historically a back-end attribute exchange, okay? Under the new model where they're renaming IDPs as CSP credential services providers, they actually provide 2 different roles and 4 different functions within those 2 different roles. So one role is the identity provider, and the other one is basically the assertion provider. Under the identity provider, there are 2 functions. One is identity proofing, and 2 is attributes. And then under the assertion provider, basically, or the token provider, I think is the exact terminology, you're doing 2-factor authentication in the assertion itself, right? What in the adoption, what organizations are finding is that without attributes, I have a very difficult user experience of mapping that particular assertion to the person in my existing system or access of how they should. And so it's been, as someone who's been deeply involved in those conversations and all that work, it's been kind of a growing pain for all of us. But I think we're getting to the point where attributes are with the assertion, and the attributes then are validated on an individual attribute basis. So my guess is, at least on the federal side, is you're probably not going to see a back-end attribute exchange, but what you are going to see is attributes with the assertion as part of an overall CSP credential service provider. Does that resonate with what you're seeing or hear, or?
If I understand, if in the example you used about Katrina,
Yep.
and doctor showing up and
Yep.
saying that the information about him being a doctor might not be in the user store that you're accessing. So
Yeah, exactly. So I think the first stage, so under GFIPM has a very detailed attribute definition, extremely detailed, right? I think what you're seeing is under the different trust frameworks, they will have different levels of what attributes are provided, okay? I think what's interesting and what hasn't been tested yet, and maybe we're digressing a little bit, is mapping an existing user to a different back-end attribute exchange. I haven't seen that in production anywhere. I think that's very useful, but we're probably a little bit away from that just as an industry.
Yeah, we did do a pilot with PMIC with GSA last year with Texas Department of Corrections.
That's right.
It was a third-party exchange, and what it was first party saying, I sort of law enforcement official, I need information from you.
Right?
You say, in order to verify your credential, I need to go to FlexState or someplace and get the fact that you are trained to an ACFR or Lincoln compliant, and
Yep.
to a third-party store, and that was the attribute that authorized to release the information to the request. And so there is some proof of concept, it's not production, but we did pilot that before.
Right.
Well-
I was working on that. Is IIR,
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, because I think that we're going to find that you're not going to get, and nor will I don't think people want, but that's more my opinion, one common repository of all attributes, right? I think the question then becomes is validating the user to the attribute and making sure that that's the same user, that then the attribute can be passed back to the original application. And I think that's probably, and you gentlemen can probably speak to that, but if you figured out how to do that, in this particular use case, that's the key thing. And there's some data mapping and signatures and authentication mapping that needs to be done very carefully within that. Okay. Right. And we're running into that more on the citizen to government basis as on the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, where they're saying, okay, I'm a citizen and I'm attaching to an IRS site, or I'm a citizen attaching to an SSA site. How do I know it's the right Peter McDonald? Because there's more than one Peter McDonald in the country, right? And there are different components around that. Great, thank you very much. Any other questions? So my comment is that don't think you need to manage the usernames for everybody. And think about how your application and your work and your mission can be actually expanded by the inclusion of other people, because there is technology and there are tools out there that can enable greater information sharing with a sense of security around the user and the user itself. So that's my key takeaway. All right, and then let me do the quick, oh, you got that, John? Okay, great, then you got the clicker.
Which one is the laser?
Laser is red button.
Red button.
Red button is laser.
Don't press the red button. Okay, so thank you all for attending. I have spent my entire career in the federal space. I've been spending the last 3 years tackling this beast called continuous monitoring. And I was excited to come and have exposure to IJIS and the applications at this level. I listened in on a couple presentations, and I heard continuous monitoring, I heard CDM, and I heard NIST Cybersecurity framework several times. So no coincidence they asked me to talk on those 3 topics. Each one of those topics could take at least a half day to go through thoroughly. So this will be an exposure to those topics, maybe establish a baseline so that as you move forward, you have a little bit more context into how it might fit into your operations. So first thing is everybody seems to struggle with how to define continuous monitoring. And it is hard to define because it's designed to be different for everybody. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's unique to each organization, and we'll talk about why that is here in a minute. I can tell you what it's not, and it's dangerous if it's treated this way. It's not a checklist to show compliance. And in the federal space, that's where it was heading very quickly. What can I do to check this box so that management is off my back, or that I show up as a green instead of a red on this chart? The problem with that mentality is you can be compliant and still be vulnerable. If you're mandated to have antivirus on your laptop and you load antivirus and you check the box, you're good. But what if you don't update the signatures? You're vulnerable. So it needs to be taken holistically that I'm doing this to improve my cybersecurity posture. And that's kind of like what success looks like. Implementing continuous monitoring, whatever framework you're following, so that your cybersecurity posture does increase and that you're in a position where you're making decisions, being able to prioritize events, what should I tackle first, based upon risk, instead of having a printout, here's all these events, I need to go out and tackle every one of these. So that's kind of where it's heading. I said it's hard to define, but I've tried to give it a shot here. People ask me all the time, my wife, my brothers, so what is continuous monitoring? I tried to take the technical lingo out of it and controls and standards and all that, and this is what I came up with. Deciding which IT processes or components are most important to your organization, deploying tools or sensors to perform or secure that process or component, and periodically checking to make sure that that tool or sensor is in place, still relevant and sufficient. It's a mouthful, but if I'm sure we'll pass these slides out. If you take a look at it, it's logical in its flow, especially when we take it through an example. But that very first part, deciding which IT process or components are most important, that right there is what shows that continuous monitoring is different for everybody. It's not a one-size-fits-all, because deciding what's important to your organization is going to differ between most people in this room. So how do we decide what's important? In most cases, that decision has been made for you in a way because it's mandated. If you look at the federal government, everybody talks about FISMA. FISMA, even though it's mandated, the way it's structured, the IT system owners still make choices within the FISMA regulations on, okay, you need to address this, but you're allowed to decide what aspect of that is more important to you based upon your mission. And there's lots of guidance that walk you through how to implement that FISMA framework. For law enforcement, it's CJIS. If you look at CJIS and the details for your IT systems, your security, these are the steps you have to take. This is what's in place. There's HIPAA for healthcare, PCI for credit card, NERC-FERC for utilities. You may be in a situation where you get to choose the framework that's going to guide you through this decision-making process and to implement continuous monitoring. And you're welcome to choose the ones that are listed above if it applies to your business. But there are also common practices that are out there. The most important or well-known is the SANS Consensus Audit Guidelines, or CAGs. The other one, Council on Cybersecurity Critical Controls. Or another example of that is DHS and their Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation. So since that's getting a lot of exposure, I'm going to take a minute here and talk about CDM. Brief history of it, Congress did appropriate $185 million for DHS to go out and implement CDM. This is very important because it's not another unfunded mandate within the federal space. It's also significant that the money was appropriated through a continuing resolution. And by definition, continuing resolutions aren't allowed to, you're not supposed to do new starts. It's just continuing your operations. But it was important enough, DHS pled their case, made their case, that Congress appropriated it through a continuing resolution. CDM involves tools and services and integration, but the priority is going to be on the tools, and we'll walk you through their thought process on that. DHS didn't have a contract vehicle with which to procure those tools for the .gov, so they worked with GSA and came up with the CMAS BPA, or Continuous Monitoring as a Service BPA. So again, DHS has this $185 million. It looks like for 2014, it's going to be a little bit lower than that, maybe 160, 170 million. And that is for federal civilian agencies, DHS will pick up the tab. However, DoD, Intel, state and local, tribal, they can all use the contract and take advantage of the prices that GSA negotiated. The caveat is you have to take your funds to the contract. In a lot of ways, I think in that scenario, they'll benefit quicker, because you can use the contract with your own money, make it happen faster. I don't know if anybody's following it, but they just awarded the first task order off of CMAS last night at 5:30. So the first nickel has now been spent on CMAS. So it's going to be a task order process, and it's important to note that there were 17 CMAS awardees. 19 people put in proposals, so it makes you wonder what those two did, not to get an award. But there are 17 awardees, which means competition. When they take a task order and they throw it out amongst those 17s who all said that this was a must-win for them, because there's money behind it, it's going to help keep prices down. So what is the CDM process? I was very fortunate that on Tuesday I co-presented on a webinar with John Stoifert from DHS, and his slides were made public, so I pilfered some of his illustrations, but gave him credit for it down here. So this is a DHS slide where you're installing and updating sensors. Those sensors create an automated search for flaws within your network. The sensors collect that data and report it back to a central repository so that you can triage and analyze those results. What you're looking for is all of the problems, but identifying which ones are worse and correcting those first. Then that gets reported up so that you can see progress, how you're doing over time, and it starts all over again. This process, the way DHS envisions it, is a 72-hour process. Every 72 hours, this is done for your entire IT system. So they're deploying tools and sensors. What do those look like? You may be familiar with SANS, CAG's Top 20, very similar, but they condensed it down to 15 functional areas. And you'll see that they're very much in line with not just with CAGs, but with what NSA is doing and what NIST is doing itself with 800-53 Rev 4. Broad buckets that go into detail as they release the requirements. Phase 1 is out now, so it's these 4 tool sets that DHS is focusing on and are providing for their customers. And it makes sense that they start here. The whole premise is you can't protect what you can't see. So the tool set, functional area 1 through 4, it's hardware and software asset management, configuration management, and vulnerability management. So the tools provide you the ability to identify all the assets on your network, software, hardware, authorized, and more importantly, unauthorized, then scan them to make sure they're configured optimally for security posture, and then scan them on a regular basis for vulnerabilities, and if there are known vulnerabilities, then go ahead and patch them. So that's what they're focused on now. Phase 2, they'll add tool sets that handle these processes later on this year. Also sitting in some of the previous discussions, I wanted to point out that there's this trust issue that's been talked about here. They are concerned about that. How do I verify that the person that's getting access to this data is trustworthy? So DHS recognizes that, and they're going to address it as well. And then phase 3 isn't until 2015 is when that'll come around. Okay, so DHS had to go to Congress and plead their case to get the funding to make this happen. And the way they sold it is with the methodology of find, fix, report, worst problems first. But then CSIS did a report that said, okay, if an organization follows this methodology, what are the likely expectations? And the very first one, 85% of cyber attacks if you follow the CDM methodology, can be stopped. And it makes sense when you look at the second stat, that 75% attacks use known vulnerabilities. I mean, 0 days are out there, but there are enough known vulnerabilities and enough systems that haven't patched those vulnerabilities that that's the path of least resistance. That's where your attackers are going to spend their time. So it doesn't require a lot of special skill to compromise those known vulnerabilities. So that's what's going on right now with CDM. The next topic I wanted to discuss is the NIST cybersecurity framework. This was a result of the executive order President Obama signed in February of last year. They started like the day after the executive order was signed. NIST put together a working group format. They had 4 work group sessions over the last year. Symantec attended all 4. I attended 2 of them. And I can tell you that they were extremely well attended by industry. This was designed to come up with a cybersecurity framework that our critical infrastructure could adopt to help them increase their cybersecurity awareness and their cybersecurity posture. But there were many more industries were represented than just critical infrastructure. I mean, everything from the critical infrastructure like financials and utilities, a lot of small businesses, a lot of legal firms, a lot of universities, just a lot of interest in what's going on with this framework. And they were very active in providing their input to help shape how this framework is going to work. So it's designed to be flexible and adaptable. It's not dictating you shall do this. It helps you adapt what you're currently doing and plan a path forward. And I'll show you what I mean in a minute. So who's going to use the cybersecurity framework? I'm going to say this first bullet, participation is voluntary, and then I'm going to contradict that in about 2 bullets. But it is meant as a voluntary framework that you don't have to use. It is targeted towards the critical infrastructure. There are already early adopters that have said we are going to use this even in draft form. Financials and utilities and even Symantec, we are using it internally to communicate to our board of directors where we're at with our cybersecurity efforts. And it's proving to be a very useful tool. Where I contradict myself is that the White House is leaning towards making this framework mandatory for the federal government. It's within their purview to do so, and it's important to note that this is not going to replace what they're currently doing. This isn't a replacement for FISMA. It's an overlay. It's another way to view what you're currently doing, and I'll show you what that means. This is important to note that they are designing incentives to help drive this voluntary use of the framework. These are under consideration until the White House releases their final document. We don't know how many or if any of these are going to make it in there. But we do know that the insurance industry is very, very interested in this framework. They see it as a way to go to their customers and say, adopt this framework and we can cut your insurance rates. So there's a financial incentive to do it. The grants aspect of it, I've heard the word grants mentioned 30 times in the talks that we've been participating in. They're considering attaching the cybersecurity framework to the grant process. So if you apply for a federal grant, they would like to see that you are adopting the cyber framework. So another reason to keep up on what's going on. There's other ones here, the liability limitation, even kudos with public recognition. But they're trying to be creative and incent people to adopt the framework.
Question on that.
Sure.
One I had heard about, and I don't see it on the list, I'm just curious, was audit. That there was an avenue to say for private sector corporations, material weakness in cyber would color the audit, clean audit opinions, and that would be
You know, I can look that one up specifically, but I hadn't heard that one myself from the perspective of the workshop. But yeah, I'll check into it.
Some of them might get some attention.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so what is the framework? So they broke it into these 5 major functions, and those functions are broken down into categories, subcategories, and informative references. I'm going to fill one out here in a second, but it's to show you that they're going from the broader task down to more specifics, so that a company can really drill down and see how they're doing with respect to the framework. The informative reference, that's going to be populated with an existing control from an existing standard that satisfies that subcategory. And it'll make sense when I paint it out. Before I do, I wanted to show an example of the categories and how they're broken out. Subcategories aren't shown here, but this does illustrate that, you know, under identity, it's a very broad category, but you can see asset management, they break identity down into quite a few categories, and then each one of those will be broken down into further subcategories. So it'll allow you to get as granular as you want based upon what you're trying to get out of the cybersecurity framework. Here's one that's filled out as a reference, and staying on identity. Again, no new controls were created for this framework. It's meant to use existing standards, existing controls that people are already using or could choose to use. What you see here in the informative reference is not an exhaustive list. They wanted to put a sample of controls from existing standards that are out there that will satisfy this requirement. These were chosen because NIST asked industry, tell us the standards that you're currently using. Provide us a list. And they took that list and then they mapped it to their framework. So that's why this is not exhaustive. Like, you don't see the CDM functional areas in here, but those would certainly qualify. Right? So it's going to look familiar to people that are already using frameworks, are using continuous monitoring in some fashion. Because we talked about the first 4 functional areas of CDM being hardware and software, asset management, configurations, and vulnerability. Well, sure enough, the first 2 subcategories, inventory of physical devices, inventory of software platforms. I'd like to point out that even if you're not at a maturity point where you aren't using any standard, it doesn't mean that you can't use this framework. You may have an asset management software program like we have IJIS. You may have that deployed and you have it up and running and it is discovering all of your assets, right? Well, you do satisfy this requirement of the framework, and you can write in what you are doing over here. It doesn't have to be listed as a standard. Now, that'll help you in the gap analysis that I'll get to in just a second. So again, the framework is designed to allow anybody along the cybersecurity maturity curve to plot where they're at and where they want to go. So to help that, NIST is writing the concept of tiers into the framework. And NIST being a scientific organization, they recognize 0 as a number, so the first one is tier 0. Believe it or not, this was a lot of discussion at some of the workshops. People took a lot of issue with them starting with tier 1, but anyway. These tier descriptions have about 5 bullets each. I just took the top one to give you a flavor for it. But tier 0 is you're at a point where you have software that is doing some of these functions, but you've never mapped it to a framework or a standard. So you're tier 0. Tier 1, you're using a formal process that allows you to develop a profile against the cybersecurity framework. Tier 2, repeatable, means that you are changing, you're recognizing when needs change enough that you need to alter your cybersecurity posture or maybe tweak some of your controls, all the way up to Tier 3 where you're adaptive, meaning you're sophisticated enough that you've got sensors, you're ingesting that data, and you're being proactive. You're saying, you know what, this is about to happen, or this is happening to me in real time, I need to change, I need to fix that. Right, so that's the concept of the tiers. And the last aspect of it is the concept of profiles within the cybersecurity framework. So again, the overarching goal of the framework, help you decide where you're at currently, where you want to be, and identify the gaps to get you to where you want to be. So anybody can start out and do a current profile, whether you're mature or immature in your processes, whether you're using a defined standard or you're doing it on your own. And you can still map what you're doing into your current profile. Then you take a look at the tiers, you take a look at the categories, decide what's important to you, what's it going to take for me to get to this target profile, and then the gaps identify themselves to help you plan how you're going to get there. So I threw a lot out at you, so I left time for questions. But what I'd also like to say, we've been living and breathing this, like myself, 3 years. We have people that have been following the NIST part of it very closely. I've been following the CDM part very closely. So we would be more than happy to entertain offline conversations, deeper dives into the presentation. I kept it product agnostic because it takes more than just one manufacturer's product to implement a full continuous monitoring solution. But of course, Symantec does fully embrace these 3 concepts, and we do have products that help to facilitate all this. So we have a few minutes left, so if you want to take any questions on this, I'd be more than happy to answer what I can.